Hello, this is Whitney from Star Hearth Astrology, and tonight I'm going to be talking about the Capricorn New Moon that happens on January 12th for all time zones in the US except for Eastern Time. It happens at exactly midnight, making it technically occur on the 13th for Eastern Time Zone. But because we're in the dark phase of the moon for, at least a day before and at least a day after, we're still, it's not going to make much of a difference. That specific date thing, especially because the heart of the new moon occurs exactly at 12:00 a.m. on the 13th. So in this video, I'm going to talk about a little bit about what makes up a new moon, rituals that you can use to kind of honor a new moon, its significance, and then what it means for the weeks following it, and its larger implications. So a new moon is kind of the reset point of the lunar month. So we've gone from the previous new moon, which was an eclipse that happened on December 14th, all the way through to a full moon that occurred in Cancer on December 29th. And then the moon wound down and we wrapped things up. And the new moon is the point of renewal. And it's this new moon in Capricorn is interesting because it is the first uneclipsed new moon that we've had in Capricorn since 2018. So for the last 2 years, both in 2020 and in 2019, we had eclipsed Capricorn new moons, which means we had solar eclipses on the south node. And so when we have solar eclipses on the south node, like the one we just had in December, but it occurred in Sagittarius, not in Capricorn, because the nodes of the moon move backwards through the zodiac. And so they have progressed into Gemini in Sagittarius instead of Cancer and Capricorn. And so eclipses are occurring in those signs now. So we have, on the one hand, it's like, oh, okay, well, this is the first kind of chilled out Capricorn new moon that we've had because it hasn't had the emphasis of an eclipse, which kind of gives it a little bit more weight and a little bit more power to make sudden changes. And so it's kind of back to, okay, maybe this is a humdrum Capricorn new moon. And so when I say humdrum, I mean a normal reset point. We get one new moon in each sign, usually per year. Occasionally we'll have 2 new moons in a sign. Like we did this summer, we had 2 new moons in Cancer. And so it's kind of the annual rebirth of that sign, and wherever it is in your natal chart, it's kind of the moment of renewal of the topics of those houses, of that house. So for instance, if Capricorn is in your 2nd house, then this is a moment of renewal for themes around personal resources that you have access to, whether that's money, whether that's what you do to make money. It can also have to do with kind of self-confidence and your sense of well-being in yourself. And so we would expect to see kind of like a wrap up of those themes, and then it would be powerful to, do some meditation or or prayer, or however you connect with your deeper sense of source or whatever you think about that. And spend some time feeling where things are being pulled. Now, this works a lot better if you've done some work around emptying and clearing. And so that's where the dark phase of the moon comes in. So if you are watching this a couple days before the new moon, you have the added benefit of being able to use the balsamic phase of the moon. So the balsamic phase of the moon is the last 45 degrees of the lunar cycle when the moon wanes down into darkness. It's called the dark moon because you can't see her because she's so close to the sun. And that starts on Saturday, the 9th. So we have Saturday, Sunday, Monday, where you'll probably feel it in your body. There's a lot of low energy that happens around the balsamic moon phase. So generally, people are just exhausted coming into the new moon. And so it can be a really good time to let go of stuff, whether that's physical stuff or mental, emotional stuff. If you need to forgive people, if you need to make apologies, if you need to forgive yourself, if you need to take a long bath and scrub off all of that dry winter skin. Those are all really good things to do during the balsamic phase. But let yourself rest. So don't let that turn into a kind of like a new way to organize your to-do list. Because there's a lot of things that if we just come into stillness, they fall away without us having to take action. And so that's really what this time in the lunar month invites us to do, is to kind of come into stillness and let those things fall away, because new things will push up if we make space for them. So yeah, that's kind of where we're sitting with this new moon. And so there's a way in which we're kind of getting back to, okay, now that we had about 2.5 years of eclipses in the sign of Capricorn, the last one being a lunar eclipse that happened on the 4th of July of this past summer. What eclipses do is they stir up the themes and the topics of that house and, kind of make sure that they're not growing slime or getting dull, or in Capricorn's case, dusty or rigid. And so that area of our lives has really been being stirred up. And so this is kind of like, okay, we get to make a beginning, because now the kind of stirring up of this pot is done for another 9 years until we have the North Node transit Capricorn. And it will be stirred up in other ways. So when the South Node transits things, we really we have a tendency to clear them out. So we process things, we get rid of things, whether they are physical or more metaphorical, psychological, spiritual structures in our lives. And so it's really almost like you bought a house and it was a tear down and you're done tearing it down. So the tear down portion is done, or at least the most destructive part of it. And so now, right, if we come into the sense of stillness and kind of ask ourselves and feel out a little bit of like, not just what we want to grow there or to build there, but what would be right for us at the current point in our lives. What would be appropriate? What is the best use of the space? Not in the sense of the most efficient use of the space, but what are we longing for that is also longing to come in? So those are kind of some questions that you can meditate on during this new moon. So that is the kind of simple piece of it, and the ways that this moon is maybe less of a big deal than we have had for the last couple of years when we've had these big kind of tidal shifts and like, okay, it's time to really remodel this space, um, and tear down this whole wing of the house or tear down the whole house. Um, Now, there are a few ways in which this new moon is a big deal. And also, if new moons say anything about the 2 weeks that follow them, so there is an idea that lunations kind of prescribe um, or tell us something about the next 2 weeks that follow them until we get the next one. So, this new moon um, is followed by a Leo full moon that happens on January 29th. So from January 12th to January 29th, we are under the influence of this new moon. And there are a lot of things that happen in between January 12th and January 29th. So I'll go into some of those as well. But first, I'm going to talk just about um, kind of the chart of this new moon and what's happening immediately with it. So the new moon occurs when both the sun and the moon come together in one point, and they come together at 23 degrees of Capricorn. Here, I will switch so that we can look at the chart itself. Okay. So the chart is set for my location, but all of the planets will be in the same spaces. It's just the angles will be different depending on and the houses will be different depending on your location. And so we have the sun and the moon conjoining each other at 23 degrees, 13 arc minutes of Capricorn, and they are very, very close to Pluto. So this new moon is conjunct Pluto. And if you notice, it also occurs very close to the degrees that the Pluto-Jupiter conjunctions happened in during 2020, which timed out the peaks of COVID within the United States. And also, it's very close to the degree of the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, which kind of time was one of the big significators of the difficulty of 2020. So in some ways, we're having a new beginning on those themes as well. But we have Pluto there, and Pluto is a trickster. Trickster is probably a gentle word. Generally, Mercury has the trickster energy, but I mean trickster in the sense that Pluto makes big things seem really small and small things seem really big. And so there's this kind of power warp or vision warp that occurs when Pluto is involved with things. So this is going to be a really important time to pay attention, because the things that are seated at this new moon, we may underestimate. We also may overestimate. So we may think something is a way bigger deal than it actually turns out to be, or a way smaller deal than it turns out to be. And it could be, we could have both experiences simultaneously. We could think it's about one thing and it turns out to be about another. The Capricorn new moon is ruled by Saturn. Saturn rules Capricorn, so we can kind of check in with Saturn to see how things are going for Saturn, to kind of get a clue as to the tone of this new moon. But before we check in with Saturn in Aquarius, I wanted to reflect on what it means to have new moons in Capricorn, because Capricorn is ruled by Saturn and has the archetype of the elder, and things move very slowly, and it is in a period of the year in terms of the seasons where it looks like maybe nothing is happening. And so it can feel a little bit confusing if these new moons are supposed to be these beginnings and they have this waxing energy of the moon, but then right? It occurs in the sign of Capricorn, which is very, very slow growth, which is why I used the image of the hoarfrost, of something that grows very slowly in just kind of this frozen space. But if we map the um, the lunar cycle onto the year, the kind of season or the holiday that corresponds with new moons is the solstice, which is the point that brings us into Capricorn. So, in some ways, if we view it through those lenses, then actually Capricorn is exactly the speed of a new moon, right? It is something that is growing in the dark so slowly that you can't see it or notice it. And it's really when we hit Candlemas in February, when the moon hits, or when the sun hits 15 degrees of Aquarius, that we switch into the season that would correspond with the waxing crescent moon, and that we would be able to see things and things would start moving more quickly. Um, so there is this kind of things are seeded. It's not clear whether they're sleeping or whether they're growing or what is stirring in the dark inside of them. Um, so I just wanted to bring up that image because I think we put a lot of pressure on new moons. You know, you're going to get up the next morning and manifest everything that you want. And that's really, new moons are dark. They're a dark time. They're not like your personal wishing day. Um, the moon is our connection to our unconscious. And when we don't tend to that, and when we don't check in with ourselves, and when we don't have a spiritual practice or some kind of self-care practice to really get in alignment with ourselves, we can seed things that we are unconscious of and maybe we don't want. And that can happen anyway, but it tends to happen more if we're moving so quickly and we're not dropping into the stillness of the sacred time of rest around the new moon. So be careful what you seed, because we're watering it in with Pluto. It's getting planted in the fertile ground of Pluto. And so you don't know which parts are going to get too big or too small. You don't know the ramifications of what starts now. And that's going to be true personally, and that's going to be true collectively. And that I don't say this to scare people or to warn people, although maybe, you don't want to start things on this new moon because it is risky, charged with Pluto. But it's more about having our eyes open so that we can really hold and embody our own power and make our own decisions, so that when those decisions have consequences, we can take responsibility for those. And we can meet them, so we can see them coming, and we can remember to watch for them, and then we can respond to them because we're not blindsided and we're not thrown into trauma spirals by being blindsided and having really strong emotional reactions. So that's what I have to say about that. So the lunation itself is ruled by Saturn, as I said. And so we check in with the condition of Saturn to see how that's going to go. And when we check in with Saturn, we see that Saturn is involved with this square to Mars, which is building and will perfect on the 13th at 4 a.m. So just 6 hours, that's 4 a.m. Mountain Time. So just 6 hours after the exact moment of the new moon, we have the exact moment of the Mars Saturn square. And this is really significant. We've kind of been waiting for this for a while because we had two other squares between Mars and Saturn, but they occurred at the end of the summer and the beginning of the fall. in the signs of Aries and Capricorn. So the square was between Aries and Capricorn, and Mars rules Aries, Saturn rules Capricorn. They were both very strong. Those squares were a lot about the frustration of the personal will and feeling powerless and feeling angry and feeling like the government and tradition and the patriarchy was this oppressive wall, and what could the rebel Mars do against it but be in retrograde and feel super angry and super frustrated and like there wasn't progress being made. So it's interesting that the final square that these two make in this one particular dance that they're doing with each other is in Aquarius and Taurus. And in Aquarius and Taurus, Saturn is still in rulership. Mars is in detriment or in exile. So Saturn is the stronger of the two with regard to sign. But they're fighting about different issues. Now, instead of, is tradition going to hold and what can Mars, the warrior in Aries, do about it? Mars is turned farmer. And in the sign of Taurus, Mars is going to care a lot more about my physical property, my money, but also just my kind of creature comfort and survival needs. So do I have food? Do I have shelter? And with the pandemic, those have become really exacerbated issues for people. And so now it's coming up against Saturn, that is in Aquarius and is a lot about ideology and what's kind of what is kind of the architecture of law and thought and government. It's also going to have a lot to do with who's on the outside. And so they're clashing. And I think some of what we saw today, I'm recording this video on January 6th, with the Capitol being breached. We're seeing a lot of what it means for Mars to enter Taurus and start trying to take land. So it's occupied the Capitol on the first day of its entrance into Taurus. So we have that square that perfects the day after the new moon. And so something can be seeded then, right? Very quickly, we're in very high stakes area because also Mars is going to activate kind of one of the main storylines that we have in the astrology of 2021, which is the square between Saturn and Uranus. So Mars over the next week, right, formed that square with Saturn, is going to conjoin Uranus on the 20th on Inauguration Day. And that is Mars conjunct Uranus is a flashpoint. And it's a flashpoint around Taurus issues, around food, around shelter, around money. That's going to look like taxes. That's going to look like people getting mad about stimulus checks, people getting mad about where the bailouts are going. It's incendiary. And there can be a tendency with Mars and Taurus to either, it's really hard to get them started and then it's really hard to stop them. There's this inertia to that placement. And so we're starting out, I don't think, with a Mars that is sleepy in Taurus. Although I feel like after 6 months of Mars and Aries, we could all use a nap. But everyone's so angry and they want to make things happen. So instead, we're dealing with raging bull Mars that's going to smack into the powder keg of Uranus that is squaring Saturn, that feels like it doesn't have any other options. And right when we get Uranus and Saturn in this kind of stalemate like this, people are going to feel cornered. And when people feel cornered, they act erratically. And so big things happen. So we're kind of in a prelude phase to that. The first exact square that they have will happen on February 17th. And so we're kind of building up to that. But Jupiter is moving more quickly than Saturn, and we will see the first and actually only exact square of Jupiter and Uranus happen on Sunday, the 17th. So we're kind of, everything's getting a little bit higher stakes. And I've talked about that Jupiter Uranus square as I think Jupiter says yes to a lot of things. And I feel like there's this Jupiterian quality of optimism that could open Pandora's box in this situation. Jupiter in Aquarius saying, yes, everybody. And it could open up things that are really hard to contain afterwards. Okay, so that's on the 17th. On the 14th, so on Thursday, we have Uranus station direct. So Uranus has been retrograde since I think August 11th, but it was right around there, moving backwards. So Uranus is stationing direct. And what the significance of that is that when planets are stationing, they stay for a long time around 1 degree. And so it's kind of just like the volume gets turned up on them. So what do we have? We've got that Mars square to Saturn, and then we have Uranus kind of stopping in one position and kind of like building the charge. Like you can almost like watch it start vibrating with Uranian stuff. And on the same day, on the 14th, we have the Sun conjoin Pluto. So we've got that exact conjunction that happens. And when the Sun conjoins Pluto, the Sun that can also represent the father or the king, conjoining Pluto can get quite inflated. So I wonder what we'll see in the behavior of Trump on that day and around that day, how he will take to getting silenced on Twitter, even though it was just for a short time, to kind of make sure that he wasn't inciting more violence. And so we could really see some inflated sense of power. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say anything new about what Trump's reaction could be. I don't know that it will surprise anyone except for possibly in magnitude. Yeah, or, you know, the Sun also represents kind of this sustaining purpose. And so it can be a real moment of truth for us about what we're trying to do. And we can end up feeling really small in the context of that. So we can have kind of this moment of doubt, this moment of feeling the futility of things around there, and that might be tied to something that happens. But it's a moment in time. It's real. It has something to teach you. But it's not the only thing that's real. So, yeah, it's a lot. The week that follows it is a lot, right? I mean, everything that I've just gone over. We've got that Mars square to Saturn. The one kind of a piece of saving grace that we have is that Venus trines Uranus, and you can see Venus in the early degrees of Capricorn trining Uranus. That perfects also on the evening of the 13th, and so there's a way in which Venus, because she rules Taurus, so she is the domicile ruler of where Uranus is, and she's in Capricorn, taking things pretty seriously, being pretty grounded. She's out of her kind of dogmatic zealotry space in Sagittarius. So, you know, that could be finding innovative solutions to things. That could soften it a little bit. We'll see how that goes. I'm sure that will happen around some things. It's a big week. And then, yeah, it builds towards that Mars conjoining Uranus on the 20th. The sun goes into Aquarius. And so the sun is going to get into a big tangle with all of this. The sun will go into Aquarius, and then it will start, it will conjoin Saturn, it will conjoin Jupiter. And on the day that the sun goes into Aquarius, no, the day after, so also on Wednesday, the moon goes into Taurus. So then the sun and the moon make these issues very personal for us. So that's part of what they do. So it's really going to hit home at that point, and it has the potential to really hit home. The other thing that happens is that on the 15th, Mercury enters the shadow of its retrograde. So we have another Mercury retrograde that starts on January 30th. And from the 15th to the 30th, Mercury is going to be moving over the degrees that it retrogrades back over during the retrograde period, which happens. It will be retrograde from the 30th until February 20th. So it's a long retrograde. Or I guess that's pretty standard, 3 weeks. Yeah. And so we can start looking for those themes that are going to be revisited in that retrograde, all starting then. So you can see there's a lot of things that can get started in the 2 weeks of this new moon. So hold on to your bonnets, folks. And yeah, I mean, if you want to watch it, keep a journal about everything that kind of starts, and we'll trace it. Those things will culminate at the Capricorn full moon, which happens on June 24th. So from now until June 24th, things are growing and we can watch them. Yeah, I hope you get some rest. I hope the busyness, you can, you know, if things are too much, you can go inward, and that's perfectly appropriate for this moment. As the lunar month picks up and the light grows, your energy will come back, and the need to engage with these things will come back. But you are allowed to find rest also, because that is the way that natural biological beings move through the world. Okay. Hope you have a great new moon and the weeks after. Let me know how things are going. I love to hear from it. If you don't want to write about it in the comments, you can always message me on my Instagram or on my website. If you enjoy this video, please like it. Feel free to share and subscribe if you want to see more technological breakdowns. Okay. Good night, everyone.